The cold, calculated CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, Ethan Steele, had never believed in love. To him, emotions were a distraction, especially after his first betrayal by someone he had trusted more than anyone. His world was one of control, power, and business deals. So when he was approached with a proposal for a contract marriage with a woman named Lily Hart, he saw it as nothing more than a business transaction. He never imagined it would shake the very core of everything he thought he knew about life and love. Lily, on the surface, seemed like the perfect choice for such an arrangement. Beautiful, poised, and the daughter of an influential family, she was exactly what Ethan needed to solidify his standing in the corporate world. They both agreed to the terms, each understanding the boundaries. No love, no strings attached. But when their marriage was sealed with an official signature, Ethan couldn't have predicted the shocking revelation that would shatter the cold walls he had so carefully built around his heart. On their wedding night, as he stood by the door waiting for her to enter, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He'd never expected to have any emotional attachment to Lily until she walked in. Her delicate beauty, her innocent eyes, and the vulnerability she carried with her all seemed so genuine. But what stunned him even more was the truth that Lily had been hiding from him. She was a virgin. Her innocence, her untouched past, made him question everything. How could someone like her be bound to a man like him, a man who had never once allowed himself to believe in love? Ethan found himself tangled in a web of conflicting emotions. His logical mind screamed at him to maintain the distance he had promised himself, to keep the contract intact and nothing more. Yet, as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that kept gnawing at him. Lily was unlike any woman he had ever met. Her softness, her gentleness, it was like she didn't belong in the harsh, unforgiving world of business he inhabited. She didn't look at him the way other women did. She didn't try to win his affection, didn't seek his attention. In fact, she seemed content, even resigned to their arrangement. Her presence, though, filled the cold spaces of his mansion with warmth, with life. She would sit quietly by the window, reading or writing, and it was in those moments that Ethan began to realize just how lonely he truly was. But the revelation about her virginity continued to haunt him. It wasn't just the fact that she was untouched. It was the realization that she had willingly entered into this marriage with no expectations of love, with no hope for anything beyond the agreement they had signed. Ethan couldn't fathom it. How could a woman with so much innocence and purity be willing to settle for something so empty? He was a man who had made peace with the idea that love was a weakness, that feelings were nothing but chains that would hold him back. Yet, every time he looked at Lily, he felt a shift in his beliefs, something that pulled at him in a way he wasn't prepared for. In the quiet of the night, he would find himself watching her, studying her expressions, searching for the cracks in her perfect facade. Was she hiding something? Was she really content in this charade, or was there a deeper truth buried beneath the surface? As days turned into weeks, Ethan's curiosity turned into an obsession. What was Lily not telling him? What was she hiding behind that calm demeanor? The unease that Ethan felt began to grow stronger with every passing day. He couldn't ignore the way his heart beat faster when he was near Lily, the way his breath would catch in his chest whenever she smiled, or when she looked at him with those innocent eyes filled with something that almost looked like trust. His hands clenched with frustration as he tried to maintain the distance he had promised himself. But it was becoming impossible. The more he tried to push her away, the more drawn to her he became. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with investors, Ethan returned home later than usual. He wasn't expecting to find Lily in the study, her eyes red and puffy, her cheeks wet with tears. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the first time he had ever seen her so vulnerable, so raw. He stood frozen at the door, unsure of what to do, unsure if he even had the right to intervene. Her voice broke the silence, soft but filled with pain. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to fall for you." The confession took Ethan by surprise. He hadn't known what to say, what to feel. His instinct was to turn away, to retreat to the safe, familiar walls of emotional detachment he had built. But instead, he found himself walking toward her, the distance between them closing with every step. He didn't know why, but he reached out, his hand brushing her cheek gently, as if testing the waters. The warmth of her skin sent a shock of electricity through him, a feeling he couldn't explain. "You should have never married me," she whispered, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "This was never supposed to be real." Her words sliced through him, sharp and painful. They confirmed his deepest fear, that she too was trapped in this lie, in this contract that was supposed to keep them apart emotionally, but which now seemed to be pulling them closer than ever before. Ethan's heart waged a battle against his mind. He wanted to push her away, to protect himself from the inevitable heartbreak, but something inside him, a part of him he had long buried, began to stir. He wanted to protect her, to take away the sadness that had taken root in her heart. But the more he tried to comfort her, the more he realized how far gone he was. Lily wasn't just a contract, a business deal. She had become something he never expected, something he was not prepared for. Ethan's world shifted once more as he stood there, his hand resting gently against Lily's cheek, his heart pounding in his chest. The truth was slowly unraveling before him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run from it or embrace it. The sharp contrast between the man he had always been, the hardened, emotionless CEO, and the man who was now facing the possibility of love, of real connection, left him unsettled. "Lily," he began, his voice low and uncertain, "you didn't sign up for this. I never wanted to make you feel like this." Lily shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, Ethan, I signed up for this knowing what it was, but I didn't expect my heart to get involved. I didn't expect to fall in love with you." The words echoed in the quiet room, hanging in the air between them like a heavy storm ready to break. Ethan felt the weight of her confession settle into his chest, and, though he wanted to deny it, to tell her that it didn't matter, he couldn't bring himself to do so. Her words pierced through him with a sharp, painful clarity. In that moment, he understood something he had refused to acknowledge for so long. He, too, was in love with her. It was the most impossible thing. The cold, detached businessman, the man who had never allowed himself to believe in love, was now consumed by it. He felt a surge of guilt rise in him. How could he let this happen? He had sworn that no woman would ever break through the walls he had built around himself, yet here he was, completely vulnerable, completely open to someone he barely knew. As the night grew darker, their conversation continued in a quiet, almost desperate tone. The truth about their feelings for each other was undeniable now, yet the contract, the agreement that bound them, was still very much in place. They were both bound by promises that neither one could break without devastating consequences. But as Ethan gazed at Lily, he realized that the hardest truth of all was that he was no longer sure if he wanted to honor those promises. He wanted to be with her, to love her, but he also knew that doing so meant breaking everything he had worked for, everything he had built with so much effort and sacrifice. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. The following days were a blur of emotions, each one more intense than the last. Ethan's mind raced as he struggled to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. Every time he looked at Lily, his heart would betray him, pulling him deeper into a world of feelings he never wanted to experience. She was no longer just a contract, no longer just a means to an end. She was a part of him, a part he didn't know how to control or understand. But even as their connection deepened, so did the danger of their situation. Ethan's empire, his carefully constructed world of business and power, was on the line. If anyone found out that their marriage was more than just a business deal, if anyone knew about the feelings that had blossomed between them, the consequences would be devastating. It was a truth that weighed heavily on Ethan's shoulders, and the pressure began to build with every passing moment. He had always known that love came with risks, but he never anticipated the cost it would exact on him. He couldn't protect Lily from the consequences of their growing intimacy, not the way he wanted to. His cold, calculated mind kept telling him to push her away, to sever the emotional bond before it grew too strong, but his heart was no longer listening. It wasn't until one evening, when Lily came to him with a troubled look in her eyes, that the reality of their situation truly hit him. She looked at him with a mix of fear and determination. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. "I can't keep living this lie." Lily had always been strong, but now there was something different in her tone. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was demanding a change. Ethan knew that this moment was inevitable. She was no longer willing to remain in this marriage without truth, without something real between them. She had fallen for him, and she couldn't pretend anymore that the contract meant more than their growing love. But even as Lily's words struck him with an emotional force, Ethan couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. He knew the consequences of letting go of the contract, of allowing his feelings to take control. It wasn't just his business that was at stake. It was everything he had built his life on. In that moment, he realized the terrible truth. Loving her might be the one thing that would ruin them both. The next few days were a whirlwind of confusion and conflicting emotions. Ethan couldn't escape the thoughts of Lily, her tear-streaked face, her vulnerable eyes. He had always believed that control was the key to everything, that without it he would be nothing. But now, his need for control seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. The more he tried to hold on to the boundaries he had set, the more they seemed to unravel, leading him to a place he didn't want to go. The tension between them was palpable. Lily was no longer the demure, silent woman he had first met. She had become a force, a woman with desires, with needs, with a heart that had longed for something more than what their marriage had offered. Her quiet strength was beginning to break through the walls he had so carefully constructed, and it scared him. One night, after another strained dinner, Ethan sat by the fireplace, his thoughts racing. Lily had been distant, her once bright eyes now clouded with sadness. He could feel the space between them growing, and it was a gap he didn't know how to bridge. He had spent so much of his life pushing people away, using his wealth and power as a shield, but Lily had shattered that armor piece by piece. When she entered the room, he didn't look up at first. His gaze focused on the flames dancing in the hearth. But then he heard her voice, soft, but unwavering. "Ethan," she said, her tone firm, "you have to make a choice." He didn't respond immediately. He knew what she meant. She was tired of living in this emotional limbo, tired of pretending that their marriage was just a contract. He could feel the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. "Do you want this to be real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or do you want to keep hiding from it?" Her question hung in the air, an unspoken challenge, a demand for the truth. And, for the first time, Ethan didn't have an answer. The walls he had built so carefully were no longer enough to keep him from facing what was inside of him. The love he had tried to deny had grown too strong, too undeniable. But, as he turned to face her, the truth was even harder to confront. There was no turning back now. He knew that if he allowed himself to truly love her, it would change everything. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built. And yet, even in the face of that fear, he couldn't bring himself to let her go. It was like a chain around his chest, pulling him closer to her, to the one thing he had sworn he would never allow himself to have. Love. The moment had come. The weight of it pressed on Ethan like an unbearable storm, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't control it. His instincts, honed through years of ruthless business dealings, screamed at him to protect himself, to close off, to walk away. But Lily's eyes, her unwavering gaze, pulled at something deep inside him, something he had buried beneath layers of cold indifference for far too long. He stood there, struggling with the choice that lay before him. On one side, there was his empire, the life he had built from the ground up, the world where he held all the power, where emotions were an unnecessary weakness. On the other side, there was Lily, an innocent woman who had come into his life in the most unexpected way, a woman who had never asked for anything but his honesty, a woman who had trusted him with her heart. He ran his hand through his hair in frustration. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he let himself become so vulnerable to someone who was supposed to be just another business arrangement? But the truth was undeniable. He had fallen in love with her. He had let his walls crumble piece by piece until all that was left was this raw, vulnerable man who didn't know how to protect his heart anymore. And Lily, she had given him everything, her trust, her innocence, her love. As he stared at her, standing there in the dim light, waiting for him to make a decision, he realized that this was no longer just about them. This was about the future. The choice to either live in the shadows of a contract that had long lost its meaning, or to step into the unknown and embrace the possibility of something real, something that could break him or heal him. "You deserve more than this, Lily," he said, his voice breaking with raw emotion. He took a step toward her, the weight of his words heavier than ever. "You deserve someone who can give you everything, someone who isn't afraid of what he feels for you." She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for the man she had always believed him to be. And in that moment, Ethan realized he wasn't sure if he had been that man all along. "I don't want to lose you," he confessed, his voice steady but full of the truth that had finally risen to the surface. "But I have to choose, either you or everything else, and I don't know how to choose." Her answer was simple, but it hit him like a tidal wave. "You don't have to choose, Ethan. If you love me, you'll choose us." And just like that, he knew what he had to do. The days that followed were a blur of decisions, phone calls, and paperwork, all of it culminating in one undeniable truth. Ethan Steele was no longer the man he once was. His heart, once encased in steel, had shattered in the most unexpected way, by the woman he had sworn would remain nothing more than a contract. Ethan had made his choice. He had walked away from the cold world of corporate control, from the empire he had spent years building, to embrace something far more uncertain, something that terrified him more than anything he had ever faced. Love. He didn't know how this would all end, if it would be a fairy tale or a nightmare. But one thing was certain. He was done living a life without love, without the one thing that had given him meaning in ways no business deal ever could. Lily was his now. She wasn't a business transaction, a means to an end. She was his heart, his reason to keep going, even when everything else seemed to fall apart. When he stood before the board, announcing his decision to step down as CEO, the looks of disbelief were as expected. His investors, his colleagues, they couldn't understand. To them, it was a betrayal. But Ethan knew better now. He understood that true betrayal wasn't leaving his company behind. It was betraying his own heart, his own happiness, in favor of a life that no longer fit him. And when he turned back to Lily, standing by his side, her eyes filled with a mixture of love, trust, and hope, he knew he had made the right decision. The contract, the cold walls, the heartless CEO, those were parts of his past, parts that had no place in his future. But life had one more twist for him. Just as things seemed to settle, just as Ethan and Lily began to carve out their own path together, a long-lost secret surfaced. The woman who had once promised him a loveless marriage, the woman who had been hiding something beneath her sweet facade, had a past of her own, a past that was far darker than anything Ethan had ever imagined. And so, as their love story took flight, they found themselves bound not just by love, but by the consequences of betrayal, by the consequences of a world they had both left behind, but could never truly escape. The battle was far from over.